I was sitting in a small reading room in the British Library on a Tuesday afternoon in March when I first noticed something that didn't quite add up. I had requested a collection of genealogical charts from the 18th century, the kind that map out European royal families in those elaborate tree formations with ornate calligraphy and small portrait medallions. I've always been drawn to these documents, not because I have any personal connection to royalty, but because I believed they represented something dependable in history, something meticulously preserved and verified across centuries. Royal bloodlines, after all, were supposed to be the most carefully documented lineages in human civilization. Kingdoms rose and fell based on who could prove their claim to a throne, so naturally I assumed that these family trees would be complete, transparent, and above all, consistent. The particular document I was examining that afternoon traced the House of Württemberg through the 1700s. I was cross-referencing it with another chart from a different archive, one that covered some of the same individuals, but from a slightly different perspective. That's when I noticed the first discrepancy. A maternal line that appeared in one document simply didn't exist in the other. Not that it was mentioned and then disputed, but rather that it was entirely absent, as if that particular ancestor had never been born. I assumed this was a clerical error, perhaps a damaged section of the original parchment that had been lost to time. But when I requested a third source, a genealogical record compiled by a different institution in Stuttgart, the same maternal line was present again, but this time with a different origin point, a different family name, and dates that didn't align with either of the first two documents. I spent the rest of that week requesting more records. What began as casual curiosity became something more focused. I started to notice a pattern that I hadn't seen before, or perhaps hadn't allowed myself to see. In royal genealogies from the late 17th century through the early 19th century, there were recurring gaps, moments where lineages seemed to begin abruptly without clear antecedents, or where records would be explained away with a brief note about lost documents or archives destroyed by fire. The official explanations were always plausible on their own. Wars had swept through Europe repeatedly during this period. The 30 Years' War, the War of Spanish Succession, the Napoleonic Wars, all of these conflicts had resulted in burned libraries, ransacked palaces, and displaced populations. It made sense that some records would be incomplete. But as I expanded my research beyond Württemberg to other European dynasties, I began to see that these gaps weren't random. They appeared in multiple royal houses across different countries during roughly the same historical window. The House of Romanov in Russia, the Bourbons in France, the Habsburgs in Austria, the House of Saxe-Coburg, and Gotha in the German states. All of them had genealogical records that showed unusual interruptions or sudden beginnings in the late 1600s or early 1700s. In some cases, maternal lines would simply vanish after 2 or 3 generations, with no explanation given. In other cases, a noble title would appear seemingly out of nowhere, attached to an individual whose parentage was described in only the vaguest terms, often with phrases like, "of distinguished foreign lineage," or "from Eastern nobility," without further specificity. I started making a list of these anomalies. In the genealogical records of the Russian imperial family, I found that several consorts who married into the Romanov line in the 18th century had backgrounds that were described inconsistently across different sources. One particular princess was listed in a French archive as having descended from a line of Eastern European nobility, but when I traced that lineage backward, it terminated abruptly in the 1650s with no prior records available. The explanation given was that her family's estate had been destroyed during a regional conflict, and all prior documentation had been lost. Plausible, certainly, but it was the same explanation I had encountered in at least 7 other genealogical dead ends across different families. The Bourbon family tree showed similar peculiarities. While the main patrilineal descent was well documented, several of the maternal lines that fed into the family during the 1700s had origins that seemed deliberately vague. I found one duchess whose family crest appeared in several royal portraits, a distinctive design featuring architectural motifs that didn't correspond to any known French heraldic tradition. When I tried to trace the symbolism of that crest, I found similar designs appearing in entirely different geographical contexts, in royal courts from Prussia to the Italian states, always during the same narrow historical period, always associated with families whose genealogical records began abruptly and whose prior lineage was described as lost or unavailable. I want to be clear about something. I'm not suggesting that there was a deliberate conspiracy to hide information. What I am observing is a pattern, a recurring set of circumstances that appears across multiple royal houses in different countries during the same era. Patterns like this can emerge for many reasons. Perhaps the administrative practices of that time were simply less rigorous than we assume. Perhaps the chaos of repeated wars genuinely did result in widespread loss of documentation. Perhaps the aristocratic families of that period were more mobile and interconnected than official histories suggest, and record-keeping simply couldn't keep pace with the complexity of their marriages and alliances. But then I started looking at the physical artifacts associated with these families, and that's when the pattern became more difficult to explain through conventional reasoning alone. I began examining portraits of the royal figures whose genealogies had shown these unusual gaps or sudden beginnings. What struck me wasn't their clothing or their faces, but the backgrounds of the paintings and the interiors of the palaces where they were depicted. There was a consistency to the architectural style that appeared again and again, regardless of whether the portrait was painted in St. Petersburg, Vienna, or Versailles. The same types of columns, the same ornamental ceiling designs, the same geometric floor patterns, the same style of grand staircases with identical proportions and decorative elements. I'm not an architectural historian, but I know enough to recognize that different regions and different periods typically produce distinctive styles. French Baroque doesn't look like Russian neoclassical, and Austrian Rococo has its own character distinct from Prussian palatial design. Yet in the palaces associated with these particular families, the ones whose genealogies showed those unusual interruptions, there was a remarkable uniformity. The Palace of Versailles, the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, Schönbrunn in Vienna, Sanssouci in Potsdam, all of them were built or extensively renovated during the same historical window, roughly between 1670 and 1750, and all of them shared architectural features that seemed to come from a common design language. I found myself looking at floor plans and exterior photographs, comparing the symmetrical layouts, the repetitive use of certain proportions, the specific ways that windows were arranged and entrances were positioned. These weren't just aesthetic choices influenced by the fashion of the time. They were systematic, almost formulaic, as if the architects were working from a shared template that transcended national boundaries. And when I looked at the decorative elements, the stucco work and the carved details, I saw recurring symbols that didn't always align with the official, religious, or political iconography of the countries where these palaces were located. Sunburst patterns, specific geometric arrangements, certain stylized representations of natural forms, all appearing in contexts where they didn't quite fit the established artistic traditions of those regions. I decided to look at maps from the period. Old cartographic documents can sometimes reveal things that later histories obscure, because map makers often included information based on what was commonly known at the time, even if that information later became inconvenient or was revised. I found a collection of maps from the late 17th and early 18th centuries, produced by various European cartographers. Many of them showed the standard political divisions we're familiar with, the kingdoms and principalities that we learn about in conventional history. But several of these maps, particularly those produced before 1720, included territorial designations that don't appear in later versions. Vast areas of northern Asia were labeled with names that seemed to suggest a degree of political organization that official histories don't acknowledge for those regions during that time. One term appeared repeatedly on these older maps, applied to territories stretching from Siberia through Central Asia, and in some cases extending into parts of Eastern Europe. It wasn't a term I had encountered in my formal education, despite years of studying European history. The maps didn't depict these areas as empty wilderness or as a patchwork of small tribal groups. They showed cities, defined borders, and in some cases, trade routes that connected these regions to European centers of commerce. Yet, in the historical narrative I had learned, these areas were supposed to have been largely unknown to European powers during that period, sparsely populated and politically insignificant, until Russian expansion brought them under imperial control in the 18th and 19th centuries. What made this particularly interesting was that the genealogical gaps I had been tracking seemed to cluster around the same time period when these cartographic designations began to disappear from maps. The maps produced after about 1740 generally no longer showed these territorial labels. The regions were either left blank, designated as unknown territories, or divided up into smaller areas with different names. This transition happened relatively quickly in cartographic terms, within a span of about 30 to 40 years. During that same window, many of the genealogical records I had been examining showed their most significant interruptions and reconstitutions. I started looking for primary sources from that period, letters and diplomatic correspondence that might reference these territorial designations or the families I had been researching. What I found was interesting in what it didn't say as much as what it did. There were oblique references in some diplomatic documents to Eastern alliances and marriages arranged with families from the distant provinces. Several letters written by minor court officials mentioned visitors from regions that were described with the same terms that appeared on those older maps. But these references were always vague, never providing specific details about the political structures or family lineages of these visitors. In one particularly intriguing document from the court of Louis XIV, I found a reference to a diplomatic reception for envoys who were described as representing territories beyond the Muscovite dominions. The letter was written by a court secretary and mentioned that these envoys brought gifts including architectural drawings and decorative objects that greatly impressed the French king. The letter noted that Louis subsequently commissioned renovations to Versailles that incorporated some of the design elements presented by these envoys. The timing of this reception, according to the date on the letter, was 1673, which corresponds almost exactly to when the major expansion of Versailles began, the expansion that gave the palace its distinctive appearance that we recognize today. I found similar references in Austrian court documents from around the same time. A series of letters from the late 1600s mentioned marriages being arranged between Habsburg princes and women from families described as of the Eastern imperial lines. These weren't references to the Ottoman Empire, which was always named explicitly in diplomatic correspondence from that era. These were different, and the description suggested that the families in question held significant status important enough that marriage alliances with them were considered politically valuable. Yet when I tried to trace the specific genealogies of the women mentioned in these letters, I ran into the same problem I had encountered before. The family lines terminated abruptly after a generation or two, with records described as lost or destroyed. I began to wonder whether the architectural similarities I had noticed might be more than coincidental. If there had been some form of cultural or political connection between these European royal houses and regions that were later obscured in official histories, it would make sense that this connection might be most visible in architecture and design, which are harder to completely erase than written records. Buildings remain standing even after documents are burned. Decorative motifs persist in stone and plaster long after the artisans who created them are forgotten. I looked more carefully at the specific symbols that appeared repeatedly in these palaces. One pattern that I found particularly striking was a specific type of ornamental design that appeared in ceiling work and floor inlays. It was a geometric pattern based on intersecting circles and star shapes, executed with remarkable mathematical precision. This same pattern appeared in the Palace of Versailles, in the Catherine Palace near St. Petersburg, in Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna, and in several smaller palaces associated with German royal families. The pattern wasn't unique to these locations, but what was unusual was the specific proportions and the exact manner of execution, which were virtually identical across these different sites, despite the fact that they were supposedly designed by different architects in different countries. When I researched the origin of this particular geometric pattern, I found that it didn't originate in Western European decorative traditions. Similar patterns appeared in Central Asian and Persian architectural contexts, but the specific variant that showed up in these European palaces had characteristics that didn't quite match either the Western European or the traditional Eastern forms. It was as if it represented a synthesis, or perhaps a shared origin point, that had influenced both regions. I started examining royal portraits more systematically, looking not at the subjects themselves, but at the objects and symbols included in the paintings. Royal portraiture follows certain conventions, and the items included in a portrait are never accidental. They're meant to communicate status, lineage, authority, and political connections. In portraits of European royalty from the early to mid-1800s, I began to notice certain objects that appeared repeatedly, but whose significance wasn't immediately obvious. There were specific types of decorative vessels, particular styles of furniture, and certain kinds of textile patterns that showed up in portraits across different royal houses. One object that appeared in multiple portraits was a distinctive type of globe or celestial sphere, more ornate than the standard scientific instruments of the period, decorated with symbols that didn't correspond to conventional astronomical notation. These globes appeared in portraits of Russian czars, Austrian emperors, and Prussian kings, always positioned prominently, always rendered with careful detail by the artist. When I tried to find out what these objects represented or where they came from, I found very little documentation. Museum catalogs that inventoried royal collections would list them simply as decorative globe, 18th century, without further explanation. There was also a recurring motif in the clothing and regalia depicted in these portraits. Certain embroidered patterns appeared on ceremonial robes that didn't correspond to the traditional heraldic symbols of the families wearing them. These weren't the standard lions, eagles, and fleur-de-lis that we associate with European heraldry. They were more abstract, geometric designs that once again seemed to echo the architectural patterns I had been seeing. The same interlocking circles, the same star formations, rendered in gold thread on velvet and silk. I want to emphasize that I'm not claiming to know what all of this means. What I'm describing are observations, patterns that emerged when I looked at royal genealogies, architecture, cartography, and material culture from a specific historical period. These patterns could have multiple explanations. It's possible that there was simply a fashion for certain design elements during the late 17th and early 18th centuries, a fashion that spread across European courts through normal cultural exchange. It's possible that the gaps in genealogical records are exactly what they appear to be, the unfortunate result of wars and administrative chaos. But what troubles me is the consistency of these patterns and the way they all seem to cluster around the same historical moment. If these were random occurrences, I would expect to see more variation, more diversity in how and when these gaps appear. Instead, what I see is a systematic quality to it, as if something significant was happening during this period that affected multiple royal houses simultaneously, something that left traces in architecture and material culture, even as it was obscured in written genealogies. I decided to look at what official histories say about this period, particularly about the relationships between European royal houses and the regions to the east. The standard narrative describes a gradual expansion of Russian imperial power into Siberia and Central Asia during the 18th century, bringing these areas under European control for the first time. The narrative describes these regions as having been largely uncivilized before Russian colonization, inhabited by nomadic peoples without significant political organization or cultural achievement. Yet this narrative sits uneasily with the evidence from earlier maps, which depicted these regions as having cities, defined territories, and organized political structures. It also doesn't explain why European monarchs would have been arranging marriage alliances with families from these regions if they were truly as peripheral and insignificant as later histories suggest. Marriage was the primary tool of diplomatic alliance in this period, and royal families were extraordinarily particular about bloodlines and status. They didn't arrange marriages with families they considered inferior or unimportant. I found a few historical accounts from the early 1700s, written by travelers and diplomats who had journeyed through the regions that appeared on those older maps. These accounts described sophisticated urban centers with impressive architecture, complex trade networks, and educated populations. One French diplomat writing in 1708 described a city in Central Asia with buildings of such grandeur and geometric perfection that they rival the greatest achievements of our own architects. He mentioned observing astronomical instruments of remarkable precision and meeting scholars who were knowledgeable in mathematics and natural philosophy. These accounts exist, but they're not widely cited in standard historical texts. They're tucked away in specialized archives, and when they are mentioned, they're often dismissed as exaggerations or misunderstandings by travelers who didn't really comprehend what they were seeing. Yet the detail in these descriptions is quite specific, and the consistency across multiple independent accounts from different travelers suggests that these weren't mere fantasies. What happened to these urban centers? According to the official narrative, they never existed, or if they did, They were minor settlements that have been romanticized by European travelers prone to exoticism. But if that's true, then we have to explain why European cartographers consistently included them on maps for several decades, why diplomats wrote detailed reports about them, and why their architectural styles seem to have influenced palace construction across Europe during the same period. There's another element to this that I found when examining family crests and heraldic symbols. In European heraldry, symbols are carefully regulated and their meanings are documented. Each element of a coat of arms is supposed to represent something specific about the family's history, achievements, or territorial claims. When I looked at the heraldic devices associated with some of the families whose genealogies showed those unusual gaps, I found symbols that didn't fit the standard European heraldic vocabulary. These weren't the typical medieval symbols derived from Christian iconography or classical mythology. They were geometric, abstract forms that resembled the architectural patterns I had been seeing, and in some cases, they incorporated elements that seemed to reference astronomical or mathematical concepts. What was particularly interesting was that these unconventional heraldic symbols appeared most frequently in family lines where maternal ancestry was vaguely documented or where genealogical records showed abrupt beginnings. It was as if these symbols were markers, indicators of a heritage that wasn't being explicitly stated in the written genealogies, but was being preserved in visual form. I also noticed something about the timing of genealogical revisions. Many royal family trees were recompiled and republished during the mid to late 1700s, often with simplified or altered versions of earlier lineages. The official explanations for these revisions usually cited the need to correct errors in older documents or to incorporate newly discovered information. But when I compared the earlier versions with the later ones, what I saw wasn't so much correction as omission. Entire branches of family trees that appeared in 17th century genealogies were simply absent from 18th century versions. Maternal lines in particular seemed to be systematically simplified, with complex lineages reduced to simple statements like "of noble birth," without further detail. This process of simplification coincided with significant political changes across Europe. The early to mid-1700s saw a consolidation of royal power in many European states, with centralized monarchies replacing more complex feudal arrangements. It was also a period when national identities were being more sharply defined, when the concept of distinct European nations with clear boundaries and unified populations was being actively constructed. In this context, it might have been politically convenient to simplify royal genealogies, to create cleaner narratives about bloodlines that were purely French, purely Austrian, purely Russian, rather than acknowledging the complex web of interconnections that actually existed. But if that's what happened, then what we call royal history is partially a constructed narrative, a simplified version of a more complex reality. And if genealogies were simplified or edited for political purposes, then we have to ask what else might have been edited. What other aspects of that period's history might have been reshaped to fit the emerging national narratives of the 18th and 19th centuries? I kept returning to those maps, to the territorial designations that appeared and then disappeared within such a short time span. The term that appeared most frequently on pre-1720 maps for those northern and Central Asian territories was one that I had encountered in several of the old genealogical documents as well, usually in phrases describing the origin of certain families as coming from the distant Eastern territories, or the Great Eastern Expanse. The term itself was treated as unremarkable in documents from the 1600s, mentioned casually as if it referred to something that contemporary readers would have understood. But in documents from the later 1700s and beyond, the term either disappeared entirely or was replaced with different geographical designations. When I searched for historical references to this term in academic sources, I found surprisingly little. Most modern historical atlases don't include it, and when it is mentioned, it's usually described as a vague European designation for poorly understood Asian territories, not as a reference to any actual political entity. Yet the map makers who included it on their charts weren't depicting vague, unknown spaces. They were showing cities, borders, and trade routes. They were representing it as a defined political geography, not as a terra incognita. There's a specific type of historical document called a armorial, which is a compiled record of coats of arms and family lineages. Several European armoriali from the late 1600s include entries for families described as originating from these eastern territories. The descriptions are brief, but they treat these families as legitimate nobility, whose status was recognized by European courts. Some of these families appear in the genealogical records I had been examining, marrying into established European royal houses in the late 17th and early 18th centuries. But when I tried to trace these families forward in time, their lineages became increasingly vague and eventually disappeared from later armorials, or they were reassigned different origins, described as coming from more familiar European territories. It's as if there was a deliberate process of genealogical revision, a systematic effort to rewrite certain family origins and to obscure connections to regions that were no longer supposed to have political or cultural significance. This kind of historical revision isn't unprecedented. We know that royal genealogies have been manipulated throughout history to serve political purposes, to legitimize claims to thrones, or to deny the validity of rival claimants. But what I was seeing seemed to be something different in scale, not isolated instances of genealogical manipulation, but a broad pattern affecting multiple royal houses across different countries during the same historical period. I started thinking about what might motivate such a widespread revision. One possibility is that the political landscape changed so dramatically during the early to mid-1700s that acknowledging previous connections to certain regions or families became politically untenable. If European royal houses had been closely connected through marriage to families from regions that were subsequently colonized or conquered, it might have been embarrassing or politically awkward to maintain those genealogical connections in official records. Better to simplify the lineages, to create a clearer distinction between the European colonizers and the colonized territories. But this explanation assumes that the power dynamics were straightforward, that European kingdoms were simply expanding into less developed regions. What if the actual situation was more complex? What if some of these eastern territories had been sophisticated political entities in their own right, with their own royal houses and cultural achievements, and the relationships between them and European kingdoms had been more reciprocal than later colonial narratives would suggest? If that were the case, then the subsequent revision of genealogies might have been part of a larger effort to reshape historical memory, to create a narrative in which European civilization had always been dominant and central, with other regions playing only peripheral roles. This would fit with the broader patterns of how European history was written in the 18th and 19th centuries, a period when European powers were actively engaged in colonial expansion, and when creating narratives of European superiority served important political functions. The architectural evidence seems to support the idea that cultural exchange during the late 17th century was more reciprocal than later narratives suggest. The design elements that appeared in European palaces during this period weren't simply European styles being exported to other regions. They represented a synthesis, incorporating elements that seemed to come from different architectural traditions. The mathematical precision of the geometric patterns, the specific proportions used in palace layouts, these suggested a shared design vocabulary that transcended any single regional tradition. I found myself wondering who the architects were who designed these palaces. In some cases, they're well documented. We know the names of the men who oversaw construction, and we have some of their writings and drawings. But in other cases, particularly for the earlier phases of palace construction in the late 1600s, the attribution is less clear. There are references to foreign masters being brought in to consult on design, or to plans received from abroad being used as templates. These references are frustratingly vague, never specifying exactly where these foreign masters came from, or who created the plans that were being followed. I also looked at the decorative arts associated with these royal courts during this period. There was a fashion in the late 17th and early 18th centuries for certain types of textiles, ceramics, and metalwork that were described as coming from the Orient or the East. But the specific origins of these objects were often left undefined. They weren't Chinese or Persian or Indian in any easily recognizable way. They had their own distinctive style, and that style appeared repeatedly in royal collections across Europe. Museums today typically catalog these objects with vague attributions, describing them as Eastern European or Central Asian, without being more specific, because the stylistic elements don't quite match the established categories for those regions. What strikes me most about all of this is the sheer number of coincidences required if there's no underlying pattern. We would have to believe that multiple royal houses independently experienced the same types of genealogical losses during the same period. We would have to believe that the architectural similarities across their palaces were purely coincidental, the result of separate architects in different countries independently arriving at the same design solutions. We would have to believe that the symbols and decorative motifs that appeared repeatedly in their material culture had no shared significance. We would have to believe that the cartographic changes, the genealogical revisions, and the cultural patterns all happened to cluster around the same historical moment for entirely unrelated reasons. Perhaps that's possible. History is full of coincidences, but the more I examined the evidence, the more these coincidences seemed to form a coherent pattern, one that suggested a historical reality more complex than what appears in standard textbooks. I'm not claiming to know exactly what that reality was. I don't have access to all the archives, and even if I did, many of the crucial documents have been lost or destroyed. What I have are fragments, traces, suggestions of connections that were once more openly acknowledged and have since been obscured. What I keep coming back to is a simple question. If royal genealogies really are as straightforward as we've been taught, if they really do represent complete and accurate records of European bloodlines, then why are there so many systematic gaps and inconsistencies in the records from this particular period? Why do maternal lines disappear so frequently? Why do family origins become vague precisely when they reference certain geographical regions? Why were genealogies recompiled and simplified during the mid-1700s in ways that eliminated information rather than adding it? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're genuine puzzles that deserve investigation. The official explanations, wars, fires, administrative chaos, these explain some instances, but they don't explain the pattern. They don't explain why the gaps cluster around specific types of lineages and specific geographical connections. They don't explain why the architectural and material culture evidence seems to tell a different story than the written genealogies, suggesting connections and influences that the genealogies themselves have obscured. I think about those portraits I examined. The royal figures posed in their grand palaces, surrounded by symbols and objects whose significance we may no longer fully understand. I think about the maps that showed a different political geography than the one we learned in school. I think about the genealogical trees that begin abruptly, as if the families they describe simply materialized out of nothing, with no prior history, no ancestral origins worth documenting. And I wonder what it would mean if we could recover some of what's been lost, if we could reconstruct a more complete picture of how these royal families were actually connected, where they really came from, and what kinds of political and cultural relationships existed in the past that have since been written out of our histories. Perhaps those connections wouldn't change our understanding of the present in any practical way. Royal bloodlines, after all, don't determine political legitimacy in most modern contexts, but they might change how we think about the past, how we understand the relationships between different regions and cultures, and how we recognize the ways that historical narratives are constructed and reconstructed to serve the needs of different eras. And maybe that matters more than we might initially think, because the stories we tell about where we came from shape how we understand who we are and what's possible for us to become.